Mary, thank you so much for coming here. March, I learned, is National Small Press Month. And so something I've really wanted to do as an adult librarian here is highlight independent authors, independent publishers, and because it's amazing. There's so many books published a year, like, I think people would find it unbelievable how many books come out, and there's a small percentage of those books that get highlighted. And so I just feel very fortunate and lucky that I can highlight, a local author whose book sounds and is amazing. And this town that we're in loves their history. Mm-hmm. They love their local authors. We're huge here in Los Gatos at wanting to support the locals. So tell me a little bit about your background. And when did you first realize that you wanted to be an author?
Okay, well, thank you very much, first of all, Brianna, for having me here. I'm so excited to be back in a library. As I told you, I haven't been in one for a while, so because of the pandemic, haven't even gone back. This is a beautiful library.
Thank you.
And can tell that the community really supports books and literature and authors. That's wonderful. And I really appreciate, as an author publisher, which is what I am, that the library system is starting to recognize more and more in independent authors and presses and publishers, small publishers. So I really appreciate that because it's taken a while.
It really has.
And there's so much, as you said, there's so much produced that I get it's overwhelming. I mean, you guys have to sort through how do we find the best books, and author publishers in the past had pretty, kind of a not so great reputation, but just because you do it on your own doesn't mean it isn't quality. And I'm very committed to working, and I can talk about that, how to make sure that it's high quality product. So.
Oh, awesome. Very excited about that.
So my background is in my whole original career is in education. I'm a local kid. I grew up in Los Altos, just down the road, not Los Gatos, but Los Altos, and went to Berkeley, and I went to graduate school at Stanford. I mean, I'm totally a Bay Area.
Yeah.
Through and through. Worked my whole career in the Bay Area and throughout California. So I became a teacher, and I taught a high school teacher, and I taught English and social studies. So I've always loved literature and writing, and I taught student newspapers, journalism. I love that. So, and then I became an administrator and ran programs and a wide teen pregnancy prevention program in Gilroy Unified.
Yeah.
I mean, a wide variety of things all in the area. And then eventually, my husband and I started and I was involved in starting some education companies around curriculum and social studies curriculum and history curriculum. So I taught, history, so I've always been interested in that as well. Yeah. And then my husband and I started a learning company, and so for a long time we were doing tutoring throughout California, all in low-income communities.
Curriculum is always so fascinating because it can differ so widely across the nation. Mm-hmm. And so people who plan and decide, I've always been fascinated by that. I've never kind of dipped, other than when I was at university, I've never dipped into the education side as an adult. So it's always really interesting hearing from that perspective.
Yeah. Well, and it's really important. What we decide to teach and how it's presented is critical. And of course, that's a very hot topic right now all across the United States. And I was involved way back a long time ago in helping start a social studies curriculum development company called History Alive. That's now very well known, been it's over 30 years old now. It's amazing. And because as a history teacher, most kids think that's really boring, and even some adults think it's boring. A lot of people do. And people like the founders and me, we were all trying to make history and social studies interesting for kids and come alive. And so I've always been interested in that. But as far as the question about being a writer, I wrote as a kid. I wrote little poems and little stories. I was always a big reader, of course. And then in about 8th grade, I just stopped. And I'm one of those people, there are many, many of us who feel like the traditional educational system did not support creativity. And
Yes.
I wanted to do creative writing, and there wasn't
Yes.
really an avenue for it. And I have very strong memories still of being in high school, asking one of my English teachers, are we going to do any creative writing? And being told, no, that is not a part of this program.
Wow.
And I was like, okay. So guess that's not going to happen. And I like writing in English, and so I'm going to be, I was a good kid, be a good student,
You're
and,
like, okay.
and write all these essays, analytical essays of other people's writing. That's what we did over and over and over again. And I did that in college, and so I always loved all that and writing. But I actually have a degree in Latin American Studies.
Which is amazing. I saw that. I was like, it's so fascinating.
Also interested in history and politics and culture and the language. And so.
We actually have a Spanish book club here.
Oh,
we have 2
really?
fluent Spanish speakers on staff, and we started it, and it's so popular. It's wonderful.
Oh, that's great.
You never know what a small community needs until you put it out there.
Yeah.
And so I saw that you got it, and I was like, oh, that's so cool.
That's always been, a big passion and interest. And, my new book, which we can talk about later, is bilingual in English and Spanish. And I was just in your children's book area looking are there any bilingual books? I found one.
Yes, we, the kids, in terms of literature, catching up, giving people voices, the children's section is phenomenal on that. You can always find something on that. I have a harder time, actually, when we try to showcase histories and cultures. I have a harder time coming up with lists because they just don't exist. But, our children's librarian, Grace, who's wonderful, it's just amazing. I'm always fascinated by what she can get.
Yeah.
So
good. That's great. That's great. Well, I saw it just looking around. But I always did writing, technical writing, we need something, this edited, I'll do it, we need a manual of, so kind of boring things, but technical things. And then I did, as an administrator, I wrote grants. So I wrote grants off and on for 20 years as just part of programs that I ran or as an independent consultant. And so, but that's all very technical, not, not literary or creative. And so then, when I was at a transition in my life where I could, we kind of closed our business down and I moved to Costa Rica and my kids went off to college and we're making a big change. I decided to really change completely and focus on writing and creativity. So that is it's been basically about since 2013. And so in that time I've written for a newspaper in Costa Rica. I've done creative stuff for my family, and then I started writing fiction, which is what really was my dream always. And so I wrote a collection of short stories. They're all set in California, very influenced by my many, many years in California public schools. One of the stories, the main character is an elementary principal in Central Valley in the Fresno area, and another one is a teenager. And who has pretty crappy home life and, has to figure out how to deal with the school and everything. So anyway, and then in that collection of short stories, the last 5 stories are start in the Mexican era and then are loosely connected over kind of through the era, kind of when I grew up in pre-Silicon Valley and through the 80s and some of the crashes, and then to contemporary San Francisco and some of the issues in San Francisco today. So I did that, and the whole collection is done. But I wasn't done with this connection of this family.
Yeah.
And so I have a zillion of other stories and my own family history and all kinds of other things to work on. But I kept coming back to that and eventually decided to focus on it. And so I created in the book, the beginning of the book is a family tree.
Which is stunning. It's stunning.
250-year family tree that I created of an imaginary family. This is a made-up family. And so in those 5 stories in the short story collection, some of those characters that are in this family tree were there. And so they didn't leave me, and I have to go back and write their story. And at first, I was always really interested in the Mexican era. It's kind of glamorous, Zorro.
Yeah,
and, it seems cool, and the big ranchos and the big parties,
Yes,
all that. So I was really interested in that, but the more I did the research, the more I realized, I have to go all the way back to when the Spanish came here. And the Native Americans were here from 10 to 20,000 years. No one really knows exactly, before anybody else came here. And that's a really long time,
Yes.
You can't even
conceive of that time, amount of time.
And then the Spanish came, and whoa, it was a big change for everybody. And so I realized I needed to go back and include that clash of cultures and values and religion and
how they're transformed by every generation.
Exactly.
By one great-great-grandfather's decision.
Yeah. Exactly.
And what trickles out from that. And it was just fascinating. And I love, so In This Land of Plenty is the book that we're talking about. We reference the beautiful family tree that I'm always so impressed when an author maps out generations, because how do you, I'm thinking of 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and I loved that book. I had to read it in high school, actually, and it was one of those ones that stuck with me. And so I just think it's beautiful, because then you get more of the whole story. And so your main character in that book, she comes to want to learn about her family through an ancestry test. And I thought that was fascinating, because it's very relatable to right now. My mom is big in Ancestry. I think we all have those relatives that are big in Ancestry. And I think it's one great way to connect with others, is realizing that we're all a part of this great movement, this great change, human history. We're not born in a vacuum.
Exactly.
So when I, was reading, I was wondering, so how did you come across the beginning origin story for the book of the ancestry? I was wondering, did this happen to you? Were you looking up your own ancestry? Did you overhear a friend's story? Or how did you come to that aspect?
Yeah. Well, I think it also goes back to those short stories, because I had done this connection of, some of the Mexican era characters, and then and there's very little in those short stories that connects them, just a little bit of land or a little, and it's not directly connected. But in the very last story in that book, it's Nicole, actually, and her great-grandmother are the main characters in this big house in the mission, and Nicole has to go take care of her great-grandmother, and she's sort of lost after college. She doesn't know what to do, and doesn't like all these jobs that are out there. Anyway, and so I had her in my head as I just knew for some reason that I wanted a contemporary character, and then to go back and be looking into her history, and so that's what this book is. It's framed by the contemporary story. Most of it is the historical story of when the Spaniards come and this particular soldier, and then following this bloodline through. But I just always wanted a contemporary character. To me, I don't know, I think it was more interesting. But on the ancestry thing, when I first started this and was conceiving of it all, it was quite a while ago now, and not Ancestry.com and all that wasn't quite as big, or it was just sort of starting. And I thought, I have to have something happen to propel this young person. She's just out of college. She's like 22, right? Or 21 in the end of college. And I have to have something happen to her that will push her to look into her family history. And so I created this horrible tragedy that her mother dies very young and out of the blue, and nobody knows why. And so she's investigating, what is this disease? She's not even looking at family history. She's looking for the disease, and then stumbles on this surprising family history. But I created that because I thought young people aren't really interested in the history. But literally in the time since I first came up with these ideas and finished the book, it's changed.
You were
and
a
young
prophet.
people well, I don't know, they've gotten more interested. That whole ancestry thing exploded. And just like you said, your mom's into it, but also I have friends my age many of them have told me, oh, my kids gave me the little test kit for Christmas, and it sat on, or birthday or something.
Yes.
And it sat on the counter. I'm not going to do it. And then the kids are like, here, spit in the tube, Mom.
Yeah, it's super easy. Let me show you.
Yeah, and it was the young people who are interested. So I think everybody loves stories, right?
Yes.
And so some of it is finding out the stories about yourself, finding out your connections. That's what I'm very interested in, human connections to the land and to each other, and across generations and across in all these different, backgrounds that we have. We are all connected, and so I'm very interested in that. But it seems like a lot of other people have gotten interested in that too.
And you were also ahead of the curve. I read nonfiction too, even though it's not my collection I'm in charge of. You're also ahead of the curve on the disease aspect, because there are a lot of nonfiction memoirs coming out about someone knowing that someone very close to them died or suffered from a disease that they learn is genetic, that not a lot of people know about, and not a lot of people talk about. And they go on a genetic ancestral journey based on that. So when I was reading, I was fascinated because it was like, whoa. So to hear you say that you conceived of this a while ago was fascinating to me, because that's what's hot right now.
Oh, interesting. I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad, because then I can, push it that way too. It was just so interesting to watch. I mean, I watched, research is a whole other issue and a topic in this kind of a book, but I had to research the contemporary issues too, including, ancestry searches and how all that works. And I watched YouTube videos of people who found out, young people who have this crazy ancestry test results, and they find the long lost brother of their, grandpa, and then, those kind of crazy stories. Like the TV show, the professor from Harvard, Henry Gates, right? Is that his name?
Yes, yeah.
He does the TV show, and he searches his own history, and then he brings in famous people.
Yes.
Does the history.
Did you know this?
Did you know,
Yeah.
You actually have African-American blood, and you think you're only white. Which is exactly what happens a lot, and that's what I wanted. That's why I had this character, and I had this father who's like, are you kidding me? We are not. We don't have anything that isn't Protestant, that isn't white, in our background, because that's what, she'd been told, and then she finds out it's a little different story.
Yes.
So I think that's reality, you know?
And the point in a family's history of, when did we forget?
Exactly.
And why did we forget?
And why do we forget? And that's another part of this story.
Yes.
That toward the end, one of these characters, I don't want to give it away for your
minor spoiler alert.
This is a little bit of a spoiler alert, because it's later in the book, but one of these characters sends a family member away. I can't give away too many details, and tells him to pretend he's white, be white, and not be Mexican. This is later on in the Mexican era. He's learned Spanish. He sounds like a gringo, and so go and be white, because that's how you're going to protect yourself. And she, and I've always been interested in that issue of passing.
Yes.
There's a lot of, vanishing half. There's a lot of
a huge
literature
theme
around
nonfiction of people getting to tell these stories of the pain it caused, the divide, the identity divide that it causes. Very relevant, always relevant, but now, especially right now.
Well, and I think people are more open to talking about it and exploring, like you said in the past. Okay, well, this is what great-great-great-grandma really, who she really was. How did that happen, like you said? And why did people cover it up? Or did she cover it up to protect herself, or whatever? And so I just think that's really interesting, and it's so much a part of our history.
Oh, yes.
Of American history.
Yes.
In all different kinds of ways. So I just felt like I had to include that, and so anyway, we'll see. And that's a character. So this book, I leave you hanging in several, in the contemporary story and in the historical story. And so, I have to keep going, and my book club fans and readers are like, when's the next book?
Like, hello.
What happens?
Yeah.
So we're going to have to see what happens, because one of these characters who's, pretending to be somebody he's not is who goes into the future. So, because I stopped the book at 1850 when the Americans take over California and it becomes a U.S. state.
Yeah. Which is a fascinating spot for a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Like, it just, because, and that's, you say a lot of people think that history when growing up is boring. And for me, I think it could always just be so confusing if not taught properly, which then, as a kid, if you're confused, you're like, okay, I'm bored.
Right.
But there's so much to learn, and like there's this history is fascinating. It is one big story, and everyone loves a story.
Exactly.
We passed along stories orally for years. We had to write them down the second we could. And so I think this is, again, I've said this multiple times, but this is the perfect time for this story in particular. And when I was, hoping to speak to a local author, this immediately just grabbed me. I was like, this is perfect. It's beautiful. It's going to capture people's interest. It's going to teach people. It's going to open their minds to things, Los Gatos and Los Altos and people just, you use words or towns, names, streets, and you don't really stop and think about the history there. Like, it looked vastly different before. So I just thought this book really encapsulated where we're headed. Because the publishing industry, in terms of the stories being told, has changed just within the last 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, sure.
So it's
a much needed change.
Totally.
It's interesting you say about the places. This has been popular with local book clubs, and so I Zoom in, or I've done only a few in person, but mostly on Zoom, as a guest and answer questions or whatever, and been interviewed by some genealogists because they're interested in the research and all that too. But anyway, I have this woman. She's married to a rabbi, very Jewish, of course, been to Israel many times, and she said, this book changed my view of the land in California. When you're in Israel, everything is connected to this historical event, this story from the Old Testament or whatever. What happened in these places? The place is really important. And she said, then here I've lived her whole life in California. She said, I never thought of it that way. And I feel I was completely delighted, because that's how I feel like, well, what was these beautiful golden hills with the oaks on that, we are surrounded by. What was it like when there were, all this wildlife and elk and grizzly bears, all these things that are now gone, and Native Americans, trying to live and survive and eke out a living on it. Or what was it like when it was still not many people and just a bunch of cows and these huge ranches and miles in between and no freeways, not
and you can kind of see things like orchards now, but they were even vastly bigger than the ones you might pass on the highway now. And again, with this type of story, it reminded me of East of Eden by John Steinbeck, who is local. And listening to his descriptions of San Jose and all these places, trying to imagine all these buildings not here. And it's fascinating. And you just think of home as being home. But you travel somewhere else to learn history, but you have one right here.
Exactly.
So, it's amazing. Let's talk about the research a little bit then. I know you mentioned YouTube, but how much did your studies kind of give you a good kickstart into the research? And, maybe what was the toughest part then?
Interesting. Okay. Well, this is fiction, right? But it's all based on California history that I could find, right? I mean, history is always interpreted by people, but so I worked really hard to make sure I was getting the history and trying to really understand what really happened. Not a whitewashed view, and that's where, like I already said, the history, the research pushed me to make sure I have to have a major Native American character. I mean, this place was Native American for so long. I mean, and then the Spanish come, you can't just pretend they weren't here. I mean, this clash of cultures and everything is key. And basically, in my view, it's a genocide. I mean, there were over 300,000 natives here probably when the Spanish came. No one knows for sure. And by the time the United States took over, there were maybe 15,000. And then, of course, the United States and the state of California was horrific, and maybe a few thousand after that. And even today, there are descendants, but the numbers are so small, and they can't get federal recognition as tribes, and it's really difficult. But anyway, so the research propelled me, and when people ask me things like, oh, how did you pick names? Or why did you have this kind of character? I mean, I always go back to the research. I found that these families, once the priests and the government of Spain said, oh, we can't just send soldiers and priests. We need to send some families and cows and settle this place.
Yeah.
These families were enormous. I mean, they had 15, 19, 10 kids, all of them. And so I'm like, I got to have a really big family, and the families had all these people that were sort of adopted, and, it was unclear whose kids they were. And okay, we got to throw some of that in there. So the research really is key. In order to research, as a history teacher for high school kids, trying to make history more interesting, I always pushed, let's look at primary source material as much as possible. And then, of course, you read interpretations. But let's get the primary sources. What were people's diaries, saying, or, and whatever the situation is. And so I realized, I need to do the same thing. I need to follow my own advice. I've got to go to the primary source material as much as possible. Of course, the Native Americans didn't have a written language, so that's much more difficult. Although in the last 50 years, there's been a lot more scholarly research and attention, and people trying to find out, well, what was it like for the natives here? But the Spanish were great diarists. They love these diaries, and they had the king says, okay, you're going to be the guy who writes the diary for the trip. But then a bunch of them, even if they weren't sort of officially given that job, just wrote these diaries. The priests, the soldiers, the governor, the head dudes, the captains. I mean, it's amazing. So there's a lot of material to look at. Of course, that's their own interpretation.
Yes.
So you have to remember that. But even just descriptions of the land, or descriptions of the Native Americans, or like Father Sarah and the missions. I mean, descriptions of what happened there. That in Carmel Mission, he had something called a death journal, and they were recording how many people were dying every day. He's quoted, one day 11 babies died. We buried 11 babies. So all this stuff you can get from primary source material. Then I also looked at the diaries of all these explorers it was that era of Vancouver was actually, the city is named after this English explorer, and he was going around, and he stopped in Monterey in the West Coast. And a guy named La Perouse, who was this French scientific exploration all over the world, and they stopped in the coast and they wrote journals. And he is actually one of the first ones who, Europeans, outsiders, outside of the Spanish themselves, who described how the Native Americans were being treated here and compared it to slavery in the islands in the Caribbean and on the coast of the other coast of the United States. And so very clearly. So there's a lot of reading that primary source material is key.
Yes.
And he of course wrote in French. So I know a little bit of French, and I could find some translation, but one reason I actually went to the California History Room at the Monterey Public Library is I was looking for a translation that I could read more of from this French explorer.
Oh, amazing.
So another part of the research is, where do you find these primary source materials? And libraries are amazing resources. Librarians I have come to adore. And I was completely, except for the school librarian when I was a high school teacher who was amazing, I didn't really get what librarians did. And I learned so much, and what amazing resources you are for your community.
Thank you. I love that you mentioned that, because a lot of people don't know. We have people, still calling in and double checking before programs or before picking something up, like, is it free? And of course. But we get asked that question at least once or twice a week about something. Like, wait, so before I come in, before I pick it up, is it? Yeah. Of course,
Yeah,
come
how
on
much
down.
do I have to pay? Interesting.
Yeah, and we have the other adult librarian heads a oral history project, and is in charge of the entire history section that we have. I can show you the cabinets upstairs
Oh, fun.
that we have. But yeah, we really, yeah, people would just send things to us. Like, I'm clearing out my mom and dad's house.
Right.
Here's paintings. Here's like, is any of this helpful? And the things that these people hold on to is just fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And so you really get that history. And yeah, so libraries are one of the places, if you guys didn't know, now you know that you can learn a lot. And people will come here if they're doing an extension on their house and they need to know, they have to go through a process where they, I don't know, look up stuff.
Yeah.
not my area of expertise, but and they come here and we have these old books that they can look through with the old land maps and stuff, and yeah, it's fascinating.
It's so wonderful. It's so important to preserve the history. And then their archives I found. So I, from an amazing librarian in Monterey, the California history librarian, who's also a genealogist and does these classes
Wow.
in genealogy research. So I took one of her classes, also free, from the Osher Learning Institute. They do free
Yes.
education for older adults or people in a community. I took this class because it was on research, and I was in the middle of doing that, and went to the California History Room. One of the benefits is we end up becoming friends, which has just been amazing.
Oh, that's
This
awesome.
is amazing treasure of a resource on research, among many other things, California history. But I learned so much from her in the class, all the different sources online, in communities, and then we got to go on this field trip to the Monterey Historical Society archives,
Oh,
which are
wow.
like, in a cold room,
Yeah.
in a vault, and you have to get permission, and
Oh
only
my
a few of
gosh.
us could go. And
That's another fiction book right there.
yeah, it was cool. Well, I mean, and so, there's, and people had given them lots of stuff, which they have to sort through. But then there's like the old Spanish, or Mexican journal, like legal books written
Wow.
in, so-and-so stole my horse, and I want
Yeah.
my horse back, and, and
The ledger.
Yeah, exactly. All these
Wow.
legal things and it was, so that's really cool. So those are great resources. But another set of resources that I think anybody researching either genealogy and family history or fiction, historical fiction, is museums. And I think those are forgotten also. And so I've been to all these museums, these
Yes.
little museums like in Almaden Quicksilver Park, where they were mining the mercury, which was needed in the gold mines. There's this lovely little museum, and there's always some volunteer who just loves the history and wants to talk your ear
Very
off.
passionate.
Yes, and tells you way more than you want to know, and points to here, go explore here, there. But I mean, I've gone to so many museums, and also I find those, so they're a great source of just general information and somebody with a passionate background, but also just the visual
Yes.
help, and I take pictures of old saddles and the clothes people wore and what the furniture looks like. And so if you're going to the creative side of it and having to invent something, it
Yes.
helps to know what it really looked like.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. I
So
would have
then-
never thought about, at a museum, you see what things looked like, but I never thought about that as a writer. Like, now you can describe, in your own
Exactly.
words. That is amazing.
Much more realistically than if I'm
Yes.
just imagining, it was a long time ago, she probably wore a long dress. Well,
Yeah.
come on, you got to be more detailed. In my
Yes.
view, I want to be detailed. I want to describe what the land looked like, and I want to describe what the clothes were like. These women in the women coming here from Spain and Mexico, and then staying here and growing up here in the Californios, they all had to ride side saddle.
Yeah.
And it's a cowboy, ranch country. Everybody's riding horses everywhere, and they have to go side saddle the whole time. I mean, that's just what they did. They didn't even question it.
Yeah.
And so then the dresses had to fit, and the saddles. Well, if you go to the little museum in San Juan Bautista, where there's the mission, and there's a museum there, and then there's there's an old hotel and an old saloon, and they have it set up like a saloon
Yeah.
in the maybe 1860s or 70s. But anyway, and then there's, the barns and all that stuff, and there's a side saddle. Like, this is what the women had to ride, and it was just so interesting to,
What
really
a find,
see the
yeah.
real thing, and imagine.
One of my goals is me and my husband's goals is to see every mission. We've only seen a couple, so you said that, and I was like, oh, we haven't seen that one.
We have a lot around here. Oh, you
do.
don't have to go far. And the Carmel mission has 5 museums inside the mission. I mean, there's.
Oh my gosh, I don't think we've hit that one yet.
Oh, you got to go to that Carmel mission. They've been doing construction.
And it's so close. Like,
yeah, exactly.
It's amazing.
Yeah, we have so many. San Juan Bautista is a classic one. All the kids who grew up around here go on field trips, there.
Yes, in 3rd grade, you had the mission project.
Everybody goes to the mission,
And thank you for sharing all that, because one of the things I was impressed by many things with your book, but the commitment to accuracy was one of the things that I was very impressed by when I was, pitching, I want to interview independent authors. Because it's so important, because I like to think of history telling us the game telephone, and if you aren't accurate and clear and precise, more gets lost with each telling. So nowadays, people might read, it's fiction, but very well researched, and think, oh, like, were those people really there? They weren't there yet, or something. It's like, no, it's been lost a little bit in retellings, but yes, like, this is how it was. All these people existed. Maybe there was only 2 people in town that were of this ethnicity, but they were there.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's really important. I believe really strongly in the research. And you asked earlier, I never answered the question about what was the hard part about it. And one of the key difficulties for historical fiction writers is this question of, well, how much history research do you do? Because it's a rabbit hole. I mean, you could go forever and ever and just keep researching and never write your story.
Yeah.
And how much do you do, not just because you like it, but to make sure that it's accurate, but it might not be perfect. And so there's, this sort of balancing act. And famous writers have written essays about that. What's her name? Rice, the vampire lady.
Rice.
Yeah, she's written a whole essay about how much historical research do you do, and how much do you just say, okay, I got the basics and I'm going for my story.
Yeah.
And I've read other writers who wrote another writer. What is it? Maeve Binchy. She writes these Irish. Binchy. Yeah.
Yes.
So she has a book on writing. And so I read her. I've read a lot of famous writers on writing.
Yeah, Stephen King has one too.
His is really good. You pick them, and some are not so good, and some, his is a classic. But she has this thing about you need to do your research. She also writes short stories, and so on the short story one, she's like, look, go get a children's book to research it. Don't send your because she was talking about writing a short story and doing the research and getting, but she's like, don't spend 5 weeks on whatever the historical topic is. Go get a children's book, get the basics. And maybe for a short story, I would say.
What great advice though for a short story.
Yeah. Like sometimes you don't have to, kill yourself doing you're not writing a PhD dissertation, right? And so that is one of the issues of that, because it's easy to spend a whole day just researching and thinking, oh man, I didn't move my story along, But the research is always important. And the other thing that's also important and hard too sometimes is I'm not linear in how I do all this, but I don't think you can be as far as the research. You have to always research. I remember being toward the very end, I'm editing and revising and in the final copy editing phase, and I'm doing research like, is this the right plant that would be there, and make sure that I don't get the wrong plant next to that river in that time period, and what do those look like, and what are they called? Because, then if you get it wrong, it's like you lose credibility.
Yes, totally. And it's so tough. I had read like an essay about that, about some people will read books specifically so they can pick apart and a writer's work. And and just kind of attack in their review only based off of maybe 1 or 2 minuscule errors. So the pressure that writers are under, especially particularly women writers,
that's true.
held to a different standard. And so it's just fascinating.
It's true. You do have that. You can't get it wrong. And I was just talking with another friend who writes the same kind of stuff, and I was talking about the math. You were constantly doing that because it's this long generations of. I'm like, okay, what year was she born? Okay, wait, how old could she have been old enough to have a baby then? Wait, I can't make sure, have her, you know what I mean?
Oh my gosh,
making sure you're getting
Wow.
your years and the ages and what's happening right.
And what would be realistic for them to be doing and interested in.
Yeah, and then of course connected to the history. Were they really doing that in 1825 out in California or whatever? But also just the age, getting the people's ages right, and then could they have a baby, and then what's the next generation? And some people have babies young, and then sometimes maybe it was a little longer. And blah, blah, blah.
Wow. So for this, I wanted to say, before I ask kind of one of my final questions, I wanted to, congratulate you. Well, there's an indie author project, and the regional contests in 14 U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces. Mm-hmm. And so every one of these regions picks an author and one of their works, and they win, and then there's a final pool for an all-time winner. But I wanted to congratulate you on making it as a finalist for this particular region, because that is just a huge feat. First of all, I was really happy that these kind of contests exist, mm-hmm. specifically for indie writers, because I mean, how else are indie writers supposed to kick their foot in the door, mm-hmm. And there's something really special about all of the finalists' work, as I was intrigued by them, mm-hmm. And putting your heart and soul in it without the other steps that other writers or writers who have been able to get lucky, mm-hmm. And so. I just wanted to congratulate you on that in person, because I just thought that was so neat.
Yeah, well, it was awesome. Very exciting. The California Indie Author of the Year for the adult fiction. Then they also have a young adult fiction.
Yes, which I thought was fantastic.
Which is also really cool to have that, yeah. I hope more states do it. I mean, I am really thrilled, because it is, as an indie author, it's very difficult to get into the library system and into bookstores.
Oh, okay.
So you have bookstores, mostly it's a personal connection. I go to all the local bookstores in the area. Okay. I'm a local author, and this is, and of course here it's local history. So that's another angle that I have. And all the local bookstores in the Carmel, Monterey area carry my book. They feature me on the indie author page. Sometimes they make a little display, whatever. And this was in COVID. I didn't get to do events, which I love to do and have done before in bookstores, of course. And help promote bookstores, because I also believe in independent authors, and independent bookstores should be paired together.
Yes, yes.
But it's really hard. The bookstores are very caught up in the traditional big publisher system.
Yes.
Which it's complicated. And the libraries can be kind of traditional, and same thing, stuck in those traditional ways of, this is always how we get the books, from these same publishers or whatever.
So at Los Gatos, people will just drop off their works, and we'll look at them. We will try to give an honest look. But yeah, it is tough. We it's still hard. Have to say no to a lot of books. Of course. So yeah.
But it was great that the library system itself is saying, and with those bibliolabs, we're gonna feature indie authors, and then very exciting to be in Library Journal. They had a spread of all the state winners in Library Journal, which I know is key for the librarians.
Huge. Yes,
I know. Yeah. But otherwise, to get in Library Journal is really difficult if you're not, published by Random House or whatever.
Penguin.
Penguin, yeah.
But again, congrats.
Thank you.
And then, I kind of had 2 more questions. One specifically about In This Land of Plenty. What is a topic, maybe, or a question that you really hope that your readers think about or take away from while reading or after they read? What's something you're hoping is sticking with them?
Yeah. Well, I sent you some questions, because I've done a lot of book clubs, so I hear these questions that come up from the book clubs and the topics they want to talk about. And then several have asked me to send them questions. I think I told you that. So I said, okay, I'll pull some together from what I'm thinking, but also from what other book clubs have brought up, these themes. I have quite a few themes in this book. It's a long book, and it covers a long period.
Couple.
Yeah, so there's a lot, strong women throughout history. I'm very interested in that. It's not just the dudes. And a lot of times, in American history and stories, literature, there's sort of the pioneer woman out on the prairie, and the husband dies, and she's stuck and left all alone, having to take care of everything. And that's sort of the only image you see. But in California, the same thing happened. It just we never hear about it in California.
Yes.
So I'm very interested in that, and also themes around family and themes around land. I mean, land use and
there's a whole book that I want to read by Simon Winchester, who is a huge nonfiction writer, called Land. And it's just all about land and what it means and how it affects cultures. And I mean, it's huge. Like land, it's not just a place, location.
Yeah. Well, and then another one that's also really close to my heart, as I'm lifelong Californian, is that this multicultural, complex place with a lot of issues, a lot of amazing things, but a lot of difficult issues, has been like that for a really long time. That is not just now. And I find it fascinating. I mean, it was multicultural from the beginning. Once the Native Americans were disrupted, and other societies came in, and the Spanish were very closed. They wanted to keep it just to Spain, but they weren't able to do that, and so not very well. There was this black market, so I included that in the book of these ships coming and trading with the cattle and all that. But the sailors were from the Hawaiian Islands. They call them the Kanakas, the Hawaiians, and Chinese were here very early. Many of them came later when, to build the railroads and the gold mines and stuff attracted them. But there were people from all over Asia early on, and then all these explorers coming from all over the world.
Los Gatos ourselves have a history with them coming over and being involved with the railroads.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And in Monterey and Carmel area where I am, the Chinese came very early and were fishermen, because it was so abundant. They were the abalone, the descriptions of abalone, literally you'd walk on the shore and look at the tide pools, and they'd just be sitting right there, and you just pick them up. And now there's almost none left, and you have to dive.
You can't imagine having them up.
It was so fertile and lush a place. The descriptions are amazing. So I'm really interested in that this has been a multicultural mixture of all kinds of different peoples from for 250 years.
Yes.
And how does that impact us, and how do we, let's use that to solve some of our problems, and not just,
to show commonality.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's beautiful almost. And it's a great way. So your readers, and I had looked over the questions that, your readers had been coming up with, and I was so impressed. I was like, wow, like they really picked apart. I mean, I'm sure there's still more things to talk about that they missed, but they picked apart everything, the grief in the family, with Nicole and her father. And yeah, I think just showing that not everything is as simple as you think it is.
Right. Yeah, like some of my readers, well, what is the deal with Nicole's dad? Was he just a jerk? Because he always like that one. Well, I think, I'm very interested in family dynamics and family relationships. And I think one of the issues there is grief and how they both are dealing with grief. And it doesn't always bring people together. No. They already had a troubled relationship, and then this horrible thing happens. Yeah. And they are distraught, and it makes their relationship even worse. Yeah. And, stuff like that happens. I mean, I know people like that. I'm sure you do too. Yes. So I'm interested in, all those things, a lot of themes.
You have people that want to keep things exactly the same as much as possible, and then you have people who can cope with the grief by finding connections. Right. And those two people, it causes friction. Yeah. And the other, like, why are you messing with this? Why are you messing with that now? Like, just haven't really, been through enough. Why are you? Yeah. And, to Nicole, it's like, wasn't this cool? Like, isn't this, I want to know more. Like,
yeah, right. And he can't deal with it.
And he's like, no, I don't want to look into things.
Yeah, no, he can't handle it. But I think, and a final one that's really, really important is how do we, build trust in ourselves and respect for the land and the people and what's happened and who we are, and we're here in order to solve our problems going forward, to improve things in the future. So as I said in my dedication so that we can the Native Americans were here for 10,000 years. Can we get here for even 1,000 years?
Yes.
And we need to find common ground. And I end the book, this book, I have to keep going, but I end it with a family reunion, a contemporary family reunion, and all these different players coming together and trying to learn from each other about the past, and how can we do that and move forward and not just, fight and destroy ourselves and,
cause
more problems.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important, and it's very contemporary issues, as one example I raised in there is that in the high school in Carmel is trying to decide what they should do about their 70-year-old mascot, which is they are the Padres, and the mascot is a cartoon character of a Padre they call Padre Bob. And the female athletes at that high school today are called Lady Padres, which is sort of weird and twisted if you really think about it.
Yeah.
And they don't feel represented, and then there's a whole issue around how did the Spanish priests treat Native Americans, and so those people don't feel respected. I mean, the whole thing is very difficult and fraught, and so I feel like those are really important issues that we need to think about and talk about, and it's hard. And there's people in that community who said, no, my grandfather was a Padre and I don't want it to change, and who cares, and and there's just, and it has not. They've had committees and bury it, and then they and it has not changed. It's the same. Wow. But I know a person who was on that committee, and his wife came to me and said, your book changed my life. I'm going to get my husband to read this book.
Wow.
And he changed his mind because of the book. So I feel like, okay, that's really good. He said, I hadn't really thought about it, whether, I'm really interested in people in their time also. So whether the Spaniards came here to colonize and settle the land and convert the natives, and how you feel about that now. At the time, that's what they were doing. They were thinking that they were bringing God to these people. You and I might have a very different view of it, but that's what they really thought. I mean, Father Sarah was a crusader. This was his life's work, right? And even though he admitted it didn't go so well in a lot of places, but that was it. So however you view that in that time, I'm interested in those people and how they justified all that and how they lived through that at the time.
Yeah.
But also, we're not in that time anymore. And so we have to look at it and not, in my view, not negate that it happened.
Yes.
To say this
We're
happened.
not saying let's not talk about the history of it.
No. But then how do we make amends now?
Yeah.
What do we do now and say this is not how we want to go forward? And I think they're really difficult questions, but I'm very interested in those questions.
Well, thank you so much. So much to think about. This was fantastic. I am just over the moon with how my first, author interview got to go. And thank you again for coming down here. I will, as always, I will link these discussion questions, any book we mentioned, any information that Mary mentioned will be on the blog post when we post, when I post this episode. I like to give everyone all the information that they can get. So stay tuned. I hope everybody has a wonderful May, and thank you so much for listening.